Hello, and welcome to another episode of Shortcut, the podcast that takes you on a shortcut to developer productivity, developer experience, and product engineering. I'm Morten.
And I'm Marilag. And today we have a very special guest, one of my good friends in the tech industry, Adrienne Braganza. Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Marilag, and nice to be with you, Morton.
We can start with telling our audience a little bit about your story. How did you get into the developer world?
Yes, I love sharing my story because I think it's generating the next wave of Filipinas and Filipinos in tech. But I'm Filipino, and as I think most Filipinos might have this experience, we're very much encouraged to go into the medical field. And my mom herself is a nurse, but unfortunately, all the stories that she told me of what she did as a nurse very much scared me away from the medical field. So I knew I never wanted to go in there. And so I was actually quite lost very early on. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought the only thing I knew I really wanted to do was to travel the world, very much like Anthony Bourdain, have my own, TV show and talk to people, learn about the culture, the food. But other than that, no real thing. And once I got to college, what really got me into STEM was uh, I needed to find a job to pay for college to help me with my expenses. And so the highest paying job at the time was a IT help desk technician. So resetting your passwords, fixing your computers. That was my very first job, anything related at all to tech. And as I started to do that job, I found that I actually like the problem solving aspect and helping people and trying to figure out why things were wrong and how things worked. So that really much pivoted me into software development. I got an internship as well because, again, driven by the fact that it helped paid for school and also slowly now starting to like what I was doing. I got into software development in that way. Fast forward, I've been a software engineer in the .NET, C Sharp, and vanilla JavaScript phase for like over a decade. And in about 2017, 2018, I had another renaissance in my career. I accidentally fell into developer relations, which is what I do now for a company called Viam. We deal with the robotics, and it's a super fun job. But yeah, I'm in developer relations now because I like to take the background of being a developer, understanding what they go through, what their hardships are, what how they think, and either try to teach them things or teach them how to do things in their process better, or teach them how to just make better software. So a lot of things can encompass that, but I really enjoy doing what I do, and it gets me opportunities to talk to folks like you.
You wrote a book about code reviews,
Yes.
and I love the title. But I guess it also prompts the question: why write a book about code reviews?
Yes, I get this question all the time. And also, thank you for um, loving the title. I knew, see, having the developer background, I knew it would resonate. And I actually had to push back with Manning a bit and to say, trust me, this title will definitely resonate. And so I'm very happy that a lot of folks are confirming that choice. But why did I write a book about code reviews? Well, honestly, when I was asked and approached by Manning, and they said, if you were to write a book about anything, what is that topic for you? And immediately I went to code reviews because there are so many different ways to do it. Every developer that I have spoken to, from my different teams to the different conferences I've spoken at, they all have different qualms and annoyances and complaints about it. And it's very interesting to start talking to different teams about what their process or lack thereof is like. And so, as I scoured everything, tried to look for other resources, there's a lot of different, like, little bits and pieces that you can learn about code reviews, right? You have different people writing blog posts of their own experiences. You have some other folks sharing best practices. You might see a little bit dedicated in other books about developer process or being a team lead or an engineering manager. But there was no comprehensive source on code reviews that says, if I were to give some junior or someone who doesn't know anything about code reviews, what would you point them to? There was no resource like that at least at the time and until now that I believe existed. So I wanted to create that resource. I wanted to say, here's what a code review could be like. Here's the essence or why we do it. And then here are all the different ways that, depending on how your team operates, you could implement it. And that was very important to me because there are experience I've had where it was a very stringent, like you need to go my way or the highway, and this is the way it's done, and there's no room for flexibility. And then there are other experiences where I said, well, there is room for flexibility, and there's a bit more buy-in with the rest of the team to create their process. So all of that fell into the creation of this book, was to say, if you wanted to know about code reviews or you wanted to improve your code reviews, here's how you do it, and here are some ways to implement it based on your team. But there is definitely not a way I could write a book that would apply to all teams. It's very much written in a choose your own adventure style, choose what works for your team. And that's what I hope this book will do for a lot of teams who read it.
You've come across a lot of different developers and have kind of observed the way they relate to each other. I think essentially when you're doing code review, it says a lot about the relationships between developers within the team or outside the team. How does code review overall affect the relationship between developers, whether in the positive and a negative way?
It impacts it greatly. When you talk to any developer, the majority would say there's something about the code review process that they despise. And that has to deal with the human side of that because, number one, overall, it's a critiquing function, right? There's some sort of the critique or feedback that needs to be addressed in some way. And it typically deals with another person, somebody on your team. So relationships impact this process very much. Example, if you're a senior developer who is reviewing a junior developer's code, you have a lot of leverage and you have a lot of power there. Do you go the empathetic route and say, hey, this could be done better and here's why? This is not following our standards. Kind of encourage them, push them towards the code that you would want the rest of the team to write, push them towards the team standards, and do it in a way that is empathetic and encouraging. Or, like my first code review process, I received a code review from a senior that was very harsh and only, aided in that reputation, the bad reputation of a code review, in that it's a negative thing. It's a scary thing. It's a place where you go to see all the things that you did wrong and why you're stupid. My experience there was, you did this incorrectly. This is a stupid way to implement that. Did you even read the documentation? So, as a junior, I knew that I didn't know everything, right? I was eager to learn. I know that I wasn't doing everything correctly, but I was also eager to learn why. And that's a very big part of what I add in this book was in the code review, the difference between constructive feedback and just terrible critique is coming from an objective place and backing up your reasons for why you're leaving that feedback. If I tell you this implementation is terrible, what am I supposed to do with that feedback as an author, right? Okay, what about it is terrible? Do I need to change it? Is it so bad that it can't pass through right now and I can fix it later? Tell me why it's terrible. I'm more likely to receive your feedback if you tell me why it's terrible, if you point out some objective fact rather than I would not have done it this way. That's kind of a very common theme I hear is that when folks address each other's feedback or do code review, it's always, their opinion against somebody else's opinion. It's always opinion against opinion. And then it becomes a debate, and then code reviews take forever and there's no middle ground found. And that's another reason why people don't like code reviews. So relationships play a big part because if you don't take into account how you're talking and communicating to an actual person, despite doing the process online and through a screen, then you're more likely to leave feedback or deal with the process in a less than empathetic way. So, keeping in mind that there's a human at the other end of this and that, you too have responsibilities as a reviewer to be empathetic, and as an author or person who opens pull requests to also be objective and not get hurt by the feedback. That's another part of it. I think we can all do better in code reviews when we remember that there's the human at the end of each of those comments.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we talk so much about feedback, and feedback is, I don't know how it is in the education in the U.S., but I don't recall any education around software engineering in Denmark where you actually have feedback as something that's on the curriculum. I honestly think that's something that could benefit all of us if we actually learned how to give proper feedback through our education, and just you learn how to code, you learn how to about architecture and software design and all of these things. But what about feedback? Because that's such an important part of it as well, right? Um, it just something that pops up again and again about giving feedback, but no one's really maybe uh, have that much experience, at least coming into it. Then your experience around giving feedback is formed by your colleagues, and yeah. So if you have some colleagues that are very good at giving feedback, then maybe you learn from them as well. But if you don't, then yeah, then you're not in a good place, maybe.
That's an
Right.
excellent point.
Yeah, and you pick it up from the overall culture, right? So you might join a company with a different way of giving feedback that you got from a previous company, and suddenly your attitude also changes. So, do you have any kind of insights or advice to teams on how to form a good feedback culture?
Yes. So I've talked to a lot of different teams and a lot of different cultures. That's one thing that a lot of people forget too about feedback is some feedback might be very harsh in one culture, while in another culture it's completely fine. It's acceptable. It's not interpreted as being rude. So, for example, in America, we always give the advice, right? If you're going to give some feedback, you do it in like a compliment sandwich, right? So you say something nice, you give the feedback, and then you end with something nice because I don't know, I guess our egos are going to be hurt if you just go directly with the feedback. And then you go to somewhere like Germany, I'll say Germany, my husband's German. They're very direct, very matter of fact. And if you tell them something is wrong, they won't be upset at that. They won't take offense to that. They want to know if something is wrong. So maybe leaving feedback for a German colleague that is, oh, this is incorrect. We need to change this. That's completely okay. But you take that and you give it to another colleague who's maybe American or maybe in the Asian countries, and they might go, oh, they might get hurt by that. They go, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't do it correctly. So keeping that in mind is one thing. It's hard to give generalized rules that say, I'm not asking you to go, depending on who your colleague is, tailor it, be nice or be direct or whatever. It's more along the lines of if you can be objective and if you can have an outcome focused piece of feedback or comment, then those should be good to any person that you give it to. So for example, when you're asking somebody to, again, make a change, or you ask someone, rename that variable because what you have right now is not clear, it's very ambiguous. Uh, you can approach writing feedback like that to say, that's an objective fact. This is not, or this is ambiguous. And then you add some objective support behind that by saying, here are some other examples within our code base that have more descriptive variable names. Use these as a guideline. And then after that, then maybe include your own suggestions of, I suggest, so and so as a more descriptive name. I give this example because what a lot of folks do will just say, I would change this to XYZ and leave the feedback as that. And again, without any objective support behind that, anybody could interpret that as, well, this is just this person saying that this is more descriptive. Like, I actually think the variable name I wrote is more descriptive than what you're suggesting. So, again, it's about becoming objective, and it's about coming from a place of objective fact and support when you do write these types of comments or give this type of feedback. And the other part about that is, if you focus on being objective and focus on an outcome and focus on supporting it with objective facts, meaning a blog post you may have read, a Stack Overflow question that's been answered, your team standards, your team working agreement, any of these sources that are not just you, those will again be more likely to be received as something that is objective, that's not attacking. It's something that's saying, here's a way to improve our code together, and here's a way that I think that we could do that. So those are the three things that I always say: keep it objective, keep it, support it with facts, and always have an outcome focused for your feedback. That way, there's very little room for misinterpretation for that if you write your comments or your feedback in that way.
Yeah. So I don't think I've ever been on a team where we haven't discussed how we should give feedback or how we should do code reviews. I guess more in the sense of code reviews of, should we focus on, let's say, the nitty pitty things of your code is not indented correctly, or the comma should be moved. Do we want to focus on that, or no? Should we focus on stuff that provides value and actually look at the design and say, okay, is there something here that should actually be changed, or do we spot something that's not, maybe the understanding of it is a little bit messy, and maybe that's something to dive into so you get a better design of the code. I'm curious if you've had any insights into why is it that almost all teams spend so much time just discussing, maybe not doing the code reviews, but discussing how to do code reviews before they actually get started.
That's a great question. And this ties very much to one of my favorite chapters, which is the team working agreement in my book. It's chapter 4. And yes, it is common. A lot of people argue about how to do things because there's no set of guidelines on what the goals are for the code review. As you mentioned, Mylag, sometimes we just do code reviews because that's what you see in the team. That's the process. You know that if you want to get your code deployed, you have to go through this thing. But other than that, a lot of teams don't give any much more thought to it than that. So what I suggest is having a lot of conversations with your team, which is the hardest part, but to actually get down into the nitty-gritty details of, why are you doing a code review? Like, who decided that we were doing this? It's generally accepted that we should do this, right? There are those. It's getting fewer and fewer now where people are like, oh, we don't need to do a code review, but that still exists out there. But for the most part, we all agree that it is a good thing. It is a key part of the software development process. Now, how do we do it? Well, you'll see, for example, one thing, people complain about the code review process because they don't decide beforehand what is an issue that you find in a code review that counts as a blocking issue. Meaning, if you find this issue as a reviewer, you are allowed to say, no, I'm rejecting this PR, or no, this needs to be fixed before it can be merged through. Or what is a non-blocking issue? Something that if you as a reviewer find it and think it's an issue, but the team has agreed that it's actually not an issue, usually formatting issues, syntax issues, low value things, then those are things that you've already agreed to beforehand, that this is a non-blocking versus a blocking issue. And something so simple as that notion of just talking that out with your team to say, okay, what are our guidelines? These are all the blocking issues, these are all the non-blocking issues. Then you put it into an agreement, what I like to call the team working agreement, which we borrowed from the Scrum world. It's basically saying, as a team, we are agreeing to enforce these guidelines around our code review, and this is one of them: blocking issues versus non-blocking issues. What's another guideline? How long does it take to review a PR? A lot of people complain because they'll say, I submitted my PR, nobody has looked at it for a week, and now I'm sitting here, doing nothing. That's not true. We all have a lot to do. But it's, again, something else to talk about. These are the little details that tend to bottleneck parts of the code review process, and then people get frustrated. And another thing that we don't think about is that every person on your team has different expectations for the code review. So if they carry those expectations, internally, and don't make that known to the rest of the team, that's where the friction occurs. One person thinks it's absolutely fine to take a day to review a PR. Another person thinks they should have reviewed this within 2 hours. Why are they not reviewing it faster? So talking those things out, getting to an agreement, getting to a compromise on your team that says how the code review works, what is the full process beginning to end, what do we do when things happen like there is a debate among a piece of feedback and it's going nowhere, and a reviewer and an author can't come to an agreement about something. Those are the things that should be discussed and ideally have some sort of guideline around to say, what do we do? And those should go into what I call the team working agreement. And the other last thing I'll say about this is that, when I mention this type of document, everyone's like, well, that this is it, everything has to be followed. This is an evolving document. So if you find something doesn't work for your team, or you've put some guideline in there that may have worked for your team initially, but then you come across a project or you add new team members or something else changes about the way you do your process and that no longer works for you, change the part in your team working agreement. It is intended to evolve with your team and how your team works. But it is meant to be this guideline that anybody on your team can go to say, I know exactly what's happening in the code review. I know exactly what my responsibilities are as either a reviewer or an author.
Right. And I guess it's also really good for onboarding new developers or new people in the team, right? Because that's also one thing that we often see. Every time you onboard a new one, then they have to start from scratch and then figure out what to do with just by reading other reviews and then I guess following that. But if you have that one document, I think it will be very helpful.
Exactly. You don't leave it to chance for the process to veer off because someone doesn't know what is happening, and you have a good guideline for anybody.
One thing I'm curious about in relation to these reviews is that I've come across a few people on a few different teams that actually prefer to receive the review in person instead of receiving it in writing, because I think by default it's always the review is always on the pull request in GitHub or in Azure DevOps or GitLab or wherever you're working. So it's almost always in writing, right? But uh, there are people that actually prefer to receive that feedback in person, and I guess to some extent maybe there's also maybe not a cultural aspect, but at least then a potential language barrier, especially in our side of the world where we are not native English speakers, but still the pull request or the reviews are in English. So maybe it's easier to articulate it or talk about it in person. So I'm curious if in writing this book, if you've come across these different ways of working with the reviews.
Absolutely. I always would defer to, if you're getting into a stalemate or you're 3 or 4 comments in on a pull request, to just stop and do exactly what you said. If you have the luxury of being, in person with your team, tap them on the shoulder, figure it out right there. If you're remote, get on a video chat really quick and talk it out synchronously. It is a thing to understand that, yes, doing this asynchronously and writing out this type of feedback on a screen, it loses all essence of body language, of nuance, of understanding, of all these things that we get with direct communication and synchronous communication. So it is important to keep that in mind, that that could actually make the code review go faster if you just give a small, you know, eke out a small time to talk face to face. Another thing that I have seen and wrote about is that when you do pair programming, that is almost a very fast iterative review cycle as well. So you're not only creating the code and writing the code together, but you're also reviewing each other's code. And that is a preferred way for a lot of folks to kind of get a pre-review or most of the code reviewed. The caveat to that, I'll say, because most folks will be like, well, if we're doing pair programming, then we don't need a code review anymore, right? We're already reviewing each other's code. And to that, I say no, because you're still subject to the problems of a single person doing code. And that's, you just now have the context and decisions that were made behind the code between two people rather than the rest of the team. So even though you have reviewed each other's code, you still want to at least document the reasons why the code is now changing when you open a pull request. And for a lot of teams, the code review is also a place where you now generally share the rest of that information to the rest of your team. So, you know, it doesn't have to be as long of a process with a single person opening a PR because you are getting that initial review faster and may come to a better solution faster, but it's still good to get fresh eyes. Fresh eyes meaning, two of you have seen it and that's you may get stuck in your own weeds there, but now you need to open it up to the rest of the team's eyes because you'll still get those benefits there. Anyone who has not been in the weeds of that code can potentially give you good feedback on that code. But that is another in-person form of review that is very much requested and liked among a lot of teams. And then the last thing about in person is um, for something like a really, really large pull request. So, a very common thing that happens is, and what we try to avoid, is opening a pull request with like 500 files change. I think we've all experienced this. I've certainly opened a PR like that before where I'm yeah, this is what was involved to make this feature. But opening really, really large pull requests, something that's almost impossible for any one person or two people to go through and thoroughly give a proper review for.
That's
So,
where the "it looks good to me" comment comes in, right? You get
yes,
the
the
pull request
rubber
gets
stamping, right? Oh,
still
trust it.
someone
This
else.
looks good. And that's where the problems happen. Exactly. But
Yeah.
a very common thing that I've seen and something that I've picked up uh, is that when you have someone open a large pull request and it's already been, set that this is not encouraged, if you open a large pull request, you are now obligated to either get your whole team together and explain it to them if it's too late to change that pull request into smaller, more meaningful chunks or just completely rewrite the pull request in general, or if you're already at the point where you've opened the pull request and you kind of just have to deal with it as is, it is your responsibility as someone opening a pull request of that sort to get to your whole team and basically explain your code, what's going on here, and do that synchronously, whether it's through a video call like this or in person. You grab everybody. That's your responsibility if you can't break it down. And what this helps ease is that if you cannot, obviously it's encouraged to just go back and make it more meaningful, make it a smaller PR, break it down into logical chunks. If you cannot do that, if you're time pressured, whatever the reason may be, going through and explaining it to your team increases the chances of a better review.
It's supposed to be collaborative and easy, right? So just pivoting a little bit, right? So in Shortcut, we always like to take perspective on different sizes of teams. Is there any, difference with code review practices between a smaller team, let's say a startup with 5 engineers, 10, versus a large enterprise or large digitally native companies that's building a tech product versus enterprises that are not software engineering organizations but build either internal or external facing software? Is there a difference? Or should we be aware of this, that we don't have to follow another team's way of doing this?
Absolutely. And it very much depends on the team. So, in your example, a startup with 5 engineers and they're all doing everything and they have a lot of control over their own process, it can be a very quick code review process. I give this example in my book where if you are a team of seasoned engineers, you're all senior or principal engineers, you've worked with each other for a while, you know how each other communicates and you know what the goal is and you know what you're trying to build, then maybe your process does not need to be so stringent. Maybe you don't need as many approvals. Maybe you don't need as much documentation. The point is, you build it around the tempo of your team and how your team works with each other. Now, you can have another small team and you can have a mix of engineers. Let's say you have a very common setup of a single senior developer, a few mid level, and maybe one junior. In this case, what tends to happen is it's very bottlenecked. It's only the senior developer who's doing all the reviews, and they feel very stressed because they have to review every PR, and it takes forever because there's only one senior who reviews it. And so, what I give in this example is that even though there's a mix of different levels or perceived abilities to review code, it's a perfect way to kind of test maybe there is this part of our code review that we need to expand. For example, the pool of reviewers. What typically happens is a mid level might get assigned a pull request and say, oh, I'm not familiar with this. I don't think I can give it a proper review. Well, they should be put there and review it with the senior at that time to actually start getting familiar with that code. They may not necessarily be required to approve the pull requests, but they can stand in as what I call an informational reviewer, where they see how the senior is reviewing that code. They see what questions are brought up. They see what feedback is being left, and they, in general, get more familiar with that piece of code. And over time, as you start to do that more and more and more, rather than just pushing it off to the senior or pushing it off to someone else who does have the experience, you now start to build up the rest of the team's experience and exposure to that code so that they eventually can be part of that reviewer pool and lessen the load on the senior developer. Another common thing too is, sometimes all the reviews or all the pull requests get sent to the senior, but not all of them require the senior's expertise. So it's a good chance to take a look at the different types of PRs that are being sent. If it's something, a small change, maybe a change to a unit test, maybe it's a configuration change that is a rote change, something small that all of the team generally should be aware of and know, change the reviewer from the senior to those other team members. Remove a lot of the load off of the senior developer and focus on giving the senior reviewer the pull requests that might actually need their expertise at the time or need their uh, nuance or history of the company or whatever, and make use of each person's time the best while also taking away some of that load. Now, you can take a lot of these principles to the medium-sized companies, to the enterprise-sized companies, depending on if your team is within that range, like 5 to 8 engineers. But then you get into like you said, the larger enterprises, where sometimes there's teams of maybe 10 engineers, 20 engineers. You have different teams who might work on the same code base. So now it's a little bit different. But what I try to set some guidelines around is the direct team that you're working within. That's the one that you want to try to set a team working agreement on and maybe share that with the other teams and see if you can get to an agreement. But the basis or the foundation of where a lot of what I suggest in the book should fall within the direct team, immediate team that you are working on. So a common example in Amazon, for example, there are multiple teams within a department, and one team might be 5 or 6 people, another team might be 5 or 6 people, another team might be 5 or 6 people. And every now and then, one external team might be asked to make a change into the code base that you are responsible for. So, a very common thing is, well, we have our guidelines, we have our standards, but now that the external team is making a change or submitting a PR, it's not following our guidelines. What do we do there? How do we do that? And for the most part, the team has that I've seen, most teams still have control over their process and still have control over their particular piece of the code base. So if you are on the reviewer end and you're the one who's accepting that code into your code base, you can still very fairly ask folks to adhere to the guidelines because this is your side of the project. This is your code base. This is how the code base works. And this is now where the objective facts come in, right? It's not our team is saying we do it this way. It's no, here are our guidelines. Here's this project standards. Here are the rules. You can even enforce them with your CI/CD processes. You can enforce them with some automations before you even open the PR. There are all these objective ways to ensure that any code that may be touched by external folks still adhere to what you have kept up in your code base. This example also works with, I just spoke to Sasha Juric, who he works mostly as a consultant. So he's on the other side of this now, right? Where he works for teams, but he's the consultant. And technically, most consultants, they're like, I'm not, bad consultants. I'll say, I'm not part of your team. I'm not going to adhere to your code review guidelines if you have any. They just kind of write their code and go, here you go. Use it if you want. It's not my problem anymore. I did my job. But Sasha brings up a good point that says, I actually want to adhere to the code base. I actually want to see guidelines. I want to adhere to your team's standards. So if you don't have that, then you're kind of leaving it open to get into this disarray and to get the different non-adherence to your code base. If you ever have to work with consultants or if you ever have to have external teams commit to your part of the code base. And that all comes back down to, it's a lot of investment initially, especially if you don't have these guidelines in place already, but it's worth it in the end and it will pay off in dividends.
So I'm curious to hear about your take on having an AI agent as part of the mix of doing pull requests. So submit a pull request, and then an agent is reviewing your code and then posting a comment. And there are different other variations of including AI into the mix of doing pull requests. But what's your take on this?
We cannot talk about it without thinking, should we just, give AI the job to code review? And my stance on that is in the book, and even today, I still say I don't think AI should do the full review. And here's why. Um, AI is definitely great. There are some great uh, agents that can do work out there. There are a lot of tools that are promising to take care of the code review for you. And some of the features that they provide, like you've been mentioning, it can study your code and make initial suggestions. It can study how your team even does reviews and suggest fixes based on what your team has suggested in the past. Um, it can do an initial pass for you, and there's one, I believe it's Code Rabbit AI, where it's aiming to solve the problem of people who take forever to answer questions. Those are viewers that seem to go away. And if you wanted to learn more about the code review, you could kind of chat with the pull request and ask questions about the changes and learn about it that way. All of these are great. I'm not saying don't use them, don't go for them. They definitely help reduce the time that it will take for us to do reviews, especially if it does those initial passes for us. It does an initial review. What I think a lot of people tend to forget is that if we start to do this and we start to rely on AI to do the code review, we're at risk of losing our critical thinking skills. But as we've seen with a lot of generative coding tools, a lot of folks just get a little bit lazier. They say, "Oh no, it's already done this for me," and I can start to just rely more and more and more. And then instead of doing that due diligence of reviewing and making sure that what the AI is outputting is correct, we kind of we're at the risk of using a tool, looking at it and saying, "Oh, it didn't find anything," and approving. That's it. Looks good to me. None of the review has gone through our own minds or our own context or our own understanding. We just fully trust the AI tool. And that's problematic because we are now using so many tools to generate code, but we're still asking folks to review it to make it correct. So I am of the opinion that because we're using so much generated code, like there's even more precedence for us to review it even closer, and to make sure a human is reviewing it, because there are still hallucinations that are happening. There's still things that AI may not be able to interpret or understand. There are human nuances and decisions that have been made behind why code was implemented in the way that it is, that AI may not fully understand. One example that I give in the book is, let's say there's this code that's written that's retrieving some data from a cache. Everything looks correct. It's following standards. It has descriptive variable names, and as the AI tool checks it, it it's fine, right? There's nothing syntactically wrong with it. But when a human looks at it, a human can quickly point out that, yeah, this code is correct and it's pulling the data from the cache correctly, but it's calling the wrong cache. This is why I still very much think a human needs to be in the loop of a code review. And so, yes, use it to make it quicker. That's where I advocate for using AI tools. Use AI to generate a description of your PR so you don't have an empty PR. Use AI to make sure your PR titles are formatted correctly, that your PRs are full of detail, it's using the right labels, you're linking to things. Use PR templates and have AI fill that out so that you're consistent and have all the information ready for the reviewer. Use AI in that way, and even use AI to have some code suggestions for what you think might be due. Use it as a first pass.
So aside from the correctness of the code itself, I think we still need a human eye to check about ethics, the basic human morality as well. We have to remember that code is what's running our society at the moment, and as a developer, you still need to write ethical and inclusive code that maybe an AI cannot capture at this point until they understand the human reasoning and the morality behind these choices on why we have written this code, right? So that's at least my take on it.
Yeah, and I think also just from my perspective at least, so I work in a pharma company where there's a lot of compliance at play, and part of that is also that the code review that we do is actually part of the validation, that the developer who created the code um, is creating a pull request, talking about what is it that was done, which should conform to the task that has been created and the acceptance criteria that's there. And then you have another human that's then reading that, looking at the code, looking at the acceptance criteria, and validating that that is actually what the code is doing. And I guess that's difficult to get an AI to do. Maybe you could probably, but I mean, that's then you're missing the human aspect of it, right?
Mm.
Maybe superficially, but yes, that's exactly why humans are still needed at this time, and I think they will always be needed, even well into the future of this AI bubble.
Yeah. I'm glad you're saying that even though you work with robotics.
Oh, that makes me even more so confident that we need to be involved. So, if that's worth anything.
Mm.
Yeah. So there's one thing that I really wanted to ask you about because I follow a lot of talks around developer productivity. And I think one thing that's popped up a few times lately is looking at pull requests also in relation to measuring how long time does a pull request lie around before anyone reviews it or before it's actually merged and then pushed to production. So that there's of course different metrics that you can look at around pull requests. I'm curious to hear your take on this, if that's something that you would recommend or maybe discourage looking at these types of things. Where are you on this?
I am of the opinion that any metric can be gamed, and any metric, if taken in isolation, is usually not telling the whole story. So, yes, I've seen this. There are GitHub actions for this that are like, that basically monitor you every dev and rate them. That says, this dev only opened 2 PRs and closed so many PRs and reviewed this many PRs. And uh, that's fine if you want to have information about how your team is doing and have it as a way to tell a story about how your team is being productive or not productive. I'm okay with that, to have information about what it is that your team is going through sprint to sprint, month to month, quarter to quarter. But what is happening is that there are a lot of teams who use these metrics and they now tie it to performance reviews, or they tie it to who needs to be put on PIP, a performance improvement plan, or, all of these, they tie it directly to the developer. And I don't think that's correct. For example, what you mentioned, there is a metric that says how long does it take for a PR to go from being opened to merged into production and being useful to, your customers. If you only take that metric into isolation and you judge someone by just that, there's so much that you're leaving out there. Who was the reviewer on it, and was there a bottleneck? How much feedback was discussed and needed to go back and forth? Was somebody on PTO? Was somebody on vacation? Was there another production fire that got in the way of PRs being reviewed? Is one person a bit more stringent in their review and someone more lax in their review? There's all these different factors that will affect specifically that metric. And so if you don't take into account all those other things, you say, okay, Adrian took an hour longer this week on pull requests. But if you look at it largely in the bigger picture and you see Adrian typically closes pull requests and merges it within, I don't know, 10 minutes or something like that, then you can start to focus in and say, why? Why is it an hour? What's taking it so long in an hour? And instead of just looking at it so closely and saying, Adrian took an hour to merge something, there's something wrong, you need to talk to her. You need to take a look and say, what other things were happening in that time? Were there fewer people available that week, so it wasn't a bigger review pool to be able to quickly get her reviews going? Was there, again, a production fire? Was there a big project deadline that needed to be adhered to, that her review was not as important as another PR? If you look for those factors and data points and add them to these other metrics that we tend to focus on, that paints a better picture of understanding why a team may or may not be productive. So I very much am of the opinion that it's fine to take all of these metrics and measurements. It's a good thing to see how your team is evolving over time, to see where maybe there is something wrong in your process that you're now starting to slow down. These are good things to have to generally understand the ebb and flow of your team.
And I also always believe that it's more important to first look at the outcome as the first metric. And then if something is not working out with the outcome, then you can use the output, which is, code reviews or commits and all that, and all the other activities as a diagnostic tool, like you said, just to like when you're diagnosing a sickness or symptom, you get all the data points to understand the reason for why things are happening. And I think especially engineering managers should be very much aware of that. All right, and I think I'll let Morton ask the magic question before we wrap up.
Yes. Um, so one of the things that we always ask our guests about is to provide a shortcut. So let's say for a team that's looking into doing pull requests, maybe a new form team getting started, is there can you provide them with a shortcut to good code reviews?
Ooh, I have a heavy pressure. Like this needs to be the piece of advice, the shortcut. Oh, I know. One that I very much like to share. So this is something I call the triple R pattern, and it's a way to form code review comments. So one really cool shortcut is just to follow the triple R pattern, especially if you have difficulty writing feedback that asks for a change. So you're asking the author to do extra work, basically, or some work. But write it with the three R's. It's the request, the rationale, and the result. So, request, what is it that you're asking the author to do? The rationale, the objective support behind why you're asking them to do that. So, that could be a link to your team working agreement, a link to code conventions, a blog, something that doesn't just say, I'm asking you to do this just because. So, rationale, and then result. What is the author give the author something to compare to. What is the end result that you're asking for so that they can get on the same page about what it is you're asking them to do? And that could be a metric, that could be a literal screenshot if it's a visual change, a literal screenshot of what it is you're asking them to do, or a piece of documentation that shows what it should look like, what code should look like or be refactored to. But if you give the author an end result that they can compare to, there's less room for misinterpretation, and there's a shortcut for them to say, here's what the reviewer is asking me for. So that ideally lessens the back and forth between you two, gets you both on the same page, and helps that feedback get addressed faster. So that's my shortcut, the triple R pattern.
Yeah, cool. Sounds great.
Mm.
And then obviously buy your book because that's a good resource to get
Good
the
piece of news, yes.
reviews. Yeah. I'm just curious. Are there any other conventions that you would recommend people to have a look at uh, around pull request comments?
Oh, yes. There is another thing that I mentioned. There's a developer, Paul Slaughter, and he created conventional comments. So if anyone's familiar with conventional commits, which is a way to format your commits to be much more structured, it's the same idea but applied to comments. So very similar. You have a tag that's a very clear indicator of what your comment is. A lot of the times we get lost in, do I have to do something? Do I not have to do something? Is this informational? Is this something I have to fix? And if you simply tag your comments that says needs fix or blocking or some other clear indicator that I need to work on this. And then another one that I hope not too many of us use, but nitpick. You label it and say nitpick. That means I don't need to care about this. It's subjective, it's an opinion, or good to know, or my team used the tag level up, meaning here's a piece of feedback that could improve this, but you don't need to work on it right now.
Yeah, great.
Mm.
We'll put that in the show notes down below,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
people can take a closer look.
Well, this has been a really insightful episode. Adrienne, thank you for spending time with us on a topic that is so prevalent in the industry and has a very high impact in overall developer experience and productivity. So, thank you so much and hope to see you next time.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Shortcut. If you enjoyed our discussion, please subscribe,
rate, and leave a review on your favorite platform. Sign up for our Shortcut newsletter at our website, Shortcu.tt, and receive our latest podcast straight to your inbox. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, and keep discovering shortcuts to engineering great products.